In 1994, the Mexican government created something they thought would save them. An elite military unit trained by American Green Berets, British SAS, and Israeli commandos. Soldiers who could rappel from helicopters, conduct surgical strikes in complete darkness, and dismantle criminal organizations with precision that rivaled any special forces unit in the world. They called them GAFE, Grupo Aeromóvil de Fuerzas Especiales. For a few years, they were unstoppable. Cartel leaders feared them. Politicians praised them. The United States government funded their training, believing Mexico had finally built its own version of Delta Force or Navy SEALs. But then, something happened that nobody predicted, something that would transform Mexico's drug war forever and create one of the most feared criminal organizations on the planet. These elite soldiers didn't just fight the cartels, they became them. And what they built was so ruthless, so militarily sophisticated, that it changed the rules of organized crime across an entire continent. This isn't just a story about soldiers gone rogue. It's about how the very weapons you create to fight monsters can become the monsters themselves. And once you understand how this happened, you'll see why Mexico's violence spiraled into something far worse than anyone imagined. Act 1. The creation. Let's go back to the beginning, because you can't understand this story without understanding what Mexico was facing in the early 1990s. The Guadalajara cartel had just splintered into multiple organizations. The Colombian cocaine route through the Caribbean was getting squeezed by American enforcement, so traffickers shifted their operations through Mexico. Suddenly, Mexican organizations weren't just moving marijuana across the border, they were controlling the primary cocaine pipeline into the United States, and the money flooding in was astronomical. Mexico's police forces were overwhelmed. Worse, they were compromised. Corruption wasn't just common, it was systematic. Entire police departments were on cartel payrolls. Local cops couldn't be trusted. Federal police weren't much better. The government needed something different, something incorruptible. So they turned to the military. In 1994, the Mexican Army established GAFE, modeled directly on American Special Operations units. These weren't regular soldiers. Candidates went through selection processes that eliminated 90% of applicants. Physical fitness that pushed men beyond their limits. Psychological testing to ensure mental resilience. Only the absolute best made it through. Then came the training. And this is where it gets interesting, because Mexico didn't just train these soldiers themselves. They sent them to the United States, to Fort Bragg in North Carolina, where American Special Forces taught them counterinsurgency tactics, close-quarters combat, intelligence gathering, and advanced weapons systems. Some trained with French commandos in jungle warfare. Others learned counter-terrorism techniques from Israeli instructors. The Mexican government was building a force that could match any special operations unit in the world. GAFE soldiers learned to operate helicopters, conduct amphibious assaults, execute hostage rescues, and gather intelligence in hostile territory. They became experts in marksmanship, explosives, communications, and battlefield medicine. By the late 1990s, GAFE had approximately 300 operators divided into specialized teams. They conducted operations across Mexico, hitting cartel safehouses, intercepting drug shipments, and arresting high-value targets. For a while, it worked. Cartel leaders actually feared these soldiers. They couldn't be bribed as easily as police. They operated with military discipline and overwhelming force. But there was a problem nobody anticipated. Act 2. The crack. These elite soldiers were risking their lives, conducting the most dangerous operations in Mexico, facing armed narcos who had unlimited money and firepower. And they were getting paid between $600 and $800 per month. Think about that for a second. You're trained by the world's best military forces. You can operate weapons systems most soldiers never touch. You conduct missions that could end your life at any moment. And you're making less in a month than some cartel street dealers make in a day. Meanwhile, you're watching cartel leaders live in mansions, drive armored luxury vehicles, and throw around more cash than you'll see in your entire military career. You're watching corruption everywhere, politicians taking bribes, police working for the people you're supposed to be fighting. The cognitive dissonance becomes unbearable. In 1997, something shifted. Reports started surfacing of GAFE soldiers going missing. Not killed in action, just gone. At first, military leadership assumed desertion, which wasn't uncommon in Mexican armed forces. But then, intelligence reports started connecting these missing soldiers to something far more disturbing. They were showing up on the other side. Arturo Guzman de Sena was one of the first, a GAFE lieutenant who'd trained with American Special Forces, earned commendations for his service, and was considered one of the unit's rising stars. In 1997, he deserted, and he didn't just disappear into civilian life. He went to work for Ociel Cardenas Hien, the leader of the Gulf Cartel. But Guzman de Sena didn't join as just another sicario, another hired gun. He came with a proposal that would change everything. He told Cardenas he could build him a private army, not just thugs with guns, but a militarized force with real tactical capabilities, an organization that could protect cartel leadership, eliminate rivals, and conduct operations with military precision. Cardenas gave him the resources, and Guzman de Sena started recruiting. Act 3. Los Zetas. What happened next was unprecedented in the history of organized crime. Guzman de Sena didn't just recruit random criminals. He went after his former comrades, other GAFE soldiers who were disillusioned, underpaid, and watching their brothers die for a government that barely compensated them. He recruited men with the same elite training, the same tactical capabilities, the same military discipline. The initial group numbered around 30 men. They called themselves Los Zetas, using radio call sign codes from Mexican military communications. Each founding member had special forces training. Many had trained internationally. They brought with them everything the Mexican government had invested in creating an elite counter-narcotics force. And now, all that training, all those capabilities belonged to the Gulf Cartel. Los Zetas changed the game immediately. Traditional cartel gunfights were chaotic affairs, spray-and-pray shootouts that relied on overwhelming numbers and firepower. Los Zetas operated differently. They used military tactics, coordinated movements, covering fire, tactical retreats, flanking maneuvers. They communicated with encrypted radio systems. They gathered intelligence before operations. They planned their hits with military precision. When Los Zetas went after rivals, it wasn't just violence, it was military operations. They would conduct reconnaissance, identify targets, plan routes, establish fallback positions, and execute with devastating efficiency. Local police didn't stand a chance. Even other cartels were outmatched. But the tactical advantage was only part of what made Los Zetas terrifying. These were men trained in psychological operations, in creating fear as a weapon. They understood that in asymmetric warfare, which is essentially what cartel conflicts are, controlling territory isn't just about force, it's about making people too afraid to resist you. So, Los Zetas introduced a level of brutality that Mexico hadn't seen before. Public executions designed to send messages, torture techniques meant to extract information and create terror, displays of violence so extreme they traumatized entire communities into submission. This wasn't random sadism. This was calculated psychological warfare, using techniques adapted from military counterinsurgency operations, but inverted. Instead of winning hearts and minds, they were crushing the will to resist. Act 4. The expansion. By the early 2000s, Los Zetas had evolved from a security force for the Gulf Cartel into something much bigger. They started operating semi-independently, controlling their own territories, running their own trafficking routes. They expanded beyond cocaine into everything: marijuana, methamphetamine, heroin, weapons, human trafficking, extortion, kidnapping, theft of petroleum from government pipelines. If it made money, Los Zetas had their hands in it. And they kept recruiting, Not just former GAFE soldiers now, though those remained the core leadership. They recruited from other elite Mexican military units, the Army's Special Forces Aeromóvil Group, the Navy's Special Forces, even deserters from Guatemalan caíbles, who had their own reputation for brutal effectiveness. They also recruited civilians, but trained them using military methodologies. Los Zetas established training camps where new recruits underwent paramilitary instruction, weapons training, tactical operations, physical conditioning, and desensitization to violence. They were creating a true paramilitary organization with military structure, ranks, discipline, and capabilities. By 2010, Los Zetas had between 3,000 and 10,000 members operating across Mexico. They controlled territory from the Gulf Coast through central Mexico. They had established operations in Central America, where they fought other cartels for control of trafficking routes through Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. The Mexican government's attempt to fight fire with fire had backfired catastrophically. The elite force they'd created to combat cartels had become one of the most dangerous criminal organizations in the Western Hemisphere. But here's what makes this story even more disturbing. It created an arms race. Once Los Zetas demonstrated the effectiveness of militarized operations, other cartels had to adapt or die. The Sinaloa cartel recruited former soldiers. The Jalisco New Generation cartel built tactical units. Across Mexico, criminal organizations started mimicking military structures, recruiting soldiers, and conducting operations with military-style planning. The violence escalated exponentially. Mexico wasn't just fighting a drug war anymore. It was fighting organizations with military capabilities, communications networks, intelligence gathering, and tactical sophistication that rivaled small armies. Act 5. The Rupture. In 2010, the relationship between Los Zetas and the Gulf Cartel finally shattered. There had been growing tensions for years. Los Zetas were making more money, controlling more territory, and operating with increasing independence. The Gulf Cartel leadership felt Los Zetas were becoming too powerful, too autonomous. Los Zetas felt they were doing the heavy lifting, while Gulf Cartel leadership took the profits. The split was violent and immediate. Suddenly, two heavily armed paramilitary organizations were at war with each other, and the battleground was Mexican territory. Mexican cities, Mexican civilians caught in the crossfire. The death toll surged. In cities like Monterrey, Reynosa, and Nuevo Laredo, gun battles erupted in broad daylight. Grenades were thrown into nightclubs. Bodies appeared hanging from bridges. Entire police forces were massacred when they were suspected of helping one side or the other. Los Zetas went on a recruitment and expansion binge, trying to match the Gulf Cartel's traditional territorial advantages. They pushed into states controlled by other organizations, fighting on multiple fronts. They took over entire towns, forcing residents to work for them or flee. Local governments became puppet administrations, with Zetas commanders making the real decisions. The Mexican government deployed military forces, but even the army struggled against organizations with military training and equipment. Firefights between Los Zetas and military units sometimes lasted hours, with both sides using assault rifles, grenades, and heavy weapons. Helicopters were shot down. Military convoys were ambushed, using tactics straight out of military training manuals. Because that's what these were. Military operations, conducted by men who'd been trained by the same instructors, using the same tactics as the soldiers trying to stop them. Act 6. The Consequences. The impact of Los Zetas on Mexico can't be overstated. Between 2006 and 2012, Mexico's drug war claimed an estimated 60,000 lives. Los Zetas were responsible for a significant portion of that violence. But the numbers don't capture the psychological impact, the way entire regions of Mexico became territories where government authority barely existed. Towns where mayors were executed for refusing to cooperate. Regions where journalists who reported on cartel activity were kidnapped and killed. areas where businesses paid protection money or were burned down. Los Zetas pioneered the tactic of forced disappearances, kidnapping thousands of people who vanished into clandestine grave sites that are still being discovered. The 2010 San Fernando massacre, where Los Zetas murdered 72 migrants traveling through Mexico, shocked the world. The 2011 Durango massacre, where over 300 people were killed and buried in mass graves. The Allende massacre in Coahuila, where Zetas systematically destroyed an entire town, killing residents and burning properties because they suspected someone had provided information to American authorities. These weren't random acts of violence. They were calculated operations designed to establish complete territorial control through overwhelming terror. But by the mid-2010s, Los Zetas were fragmenting. Mexican and American law enforcement had targeted the leadership systematically. Heriberto Lascano, who'd taken over after Guzman de Sena was killed in 2002, was killed by Mexican Marines in 2012. Other top leaders were arrested or killed in operations that used intelligence sharing between Mexican and American agencies. Without the military discipline imposed by the original GAFE founders, Los Zetas splintered into factions. Different commanders controlled different territories, sometimes fighting each other as much as they fought rival cartels. The organization fractured into groups like the Northeast Cartel and the Old School Zetas, each claiming legitimacy as the true successors. The fragmentation didn't make the violence better. If anything, it made things worse, because now multiple armed groups were fighting over what Los Zetas had controlled, and none had the organizational discipline of the original group. Conclusion. So what can we learn from the story of GAFE and Los Zetas? First, that creating elite military forces is easy. Keeping them loyal is the hard part. When you train soldiers to be weapons, you can't underpay them, undervalue them, and expect them to stay on your side forever. Mexico created some of the most capable special operations soldiers in Latin America, then offered them poverty wages while they watched criminals make fortunes. The outcome was predictable. Second, that militarizing crime is a one-way street. Once Los Zetas showed that military tactics and organization gave cartels a decisive advantage, there was no going back. Every major cartel in Mexico had to either militarize or be destroyed by those who had. The result is that Mexico's criminal organizations now operate with capabilities that would have seemed impossible 30 years ago. Third, that the tools you create to fight your enemies can become more dangerous than the original threat. Mexico built GAFE to fight cartels. Instead, GAFE soldiers built the most dangerous cartel Mexico had ever seen. Today, Los Zetas as an organization are shadows of what they were in their peak. But their legacy lives on in every militarized cartel operation, in every tactical unit employed by criminal organizations, in every former soldier recruited by the narcos. The Mexican government created a weapon to fight monsters. That weapon became the monster, and Mexico is still living with the consequences.